Hello everyone, wishing you all a wonderful day. Today, we're about to dive into a heartbreaking story filled with love, fear, and one life-changing DNA test that could destroy everything James and Diep have been holding on to. What if the person you cherish most might suddenly become the one you're forbidden to love? Stay with me as we uncover this emotional journey together. And if you enjoy this kind of story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next videos. Morning light slipped through the curtains and spread across the old wooden table, warm and gentle. James sat beside Nye, cutting up the hot food into small, careful bites. His hands moved slowly, like he wanted the moment to last a little longer. His voice was soft when he asked, "Are you hungry?" Nye looked up at him right away, her eyes bright, and nodded with eager excitement. James smiled at her, but behind that smile, something heavy sat in his chest. It was the kind of fear he couldn't say out loud, the kind that made an ordinary morning feel painfully precious. He adjusted her chopsticks in her little hands and reminded her gently, "Careful, it's still hot." Then he added with a warm, encouraging tone, "Eat a lot so you'll have energy to play with your friends." Nye listened obediently, cheeks turning rosy as she chewed happily. She seemed completely at ease, lost in the simple comfort of breakfast, unaware of the storm building quietly in James's heart. He watched her closely, taking in every small expression, every little movement, as if he were trying to memorize a life that might change by tomorrow. When she finished eating, James reached over and wiped her mouth with practiced tenderness. His voice turned firm, but it was still full of affection. "Be a good girl at school, Nye." The words sounded simple, almost casual, but to James, they felt like a promise. No matter what happened next, no matter how badly life might shift, he wanted to remain the one steady, safe thing in her world. He wanted to protect these tiny moments for as long as he could. Outside, the sunlight grew stronger, pouring into the room and lighting up Nye's face. She looked so pure, so bright, that it only made the shadow in James's mind feel darker. He stood up and walked her to the door, holding her hand a little tighter than usual. His fingers lingered around hers, like some part of him didn't want to let go. Then the door closed behind her. And just like that, the house fell quiet. James stood there alone, surrounded by silence, carrying a fear no one could see, and a fragile hope he barely dared to believe. He wanted everything to stay exactly as it was. He wanted this ordinary life, this gentle rhythm, to go on forever. But deep down, he knew tomorrow could tear it all apart. Later, under the mild midday sun, James stood in the open field beside Diep. The soil had just been turned dark and damp, and the scent of fresh earth mixed with the smell of grass drifting through the air. Both of them bent over their work, hands already streaked with dirt. Diep pointed toward the rows in front of them and said calmly, "I'll plant cabbage in these 2 rows and kohlrabi in this one. What do you think?" James nodded and gave her a small smile. But now there was strain hidden inside it, a tension he could no longer fully cover. Still, he followed her instructions carefully, placing the seeds one by one in the straight line she had shown him. Every motion felt deliberate, like he was slowing himself down on purpose, trying to stretch time with his own hands. "James, please plant them in a straight line for me," Diep said, her voice gentle, trusting. Something in those simple words warmed him unexpectedly. He didn't say much, but inside, his chest tightened with a mix of comfort and pain. He wanted to hold on to that trust. He wanted to keep standing beside her like this. When they finished, Diep looked over the rose and asked, "Is this okay?" James glanced down and answered, "Yes, it's okay." It was such a small exchange, but in that moment, standing side by side with dirt on their hands and sweat on their skin, they felt like real partners, like two people building something together. Diep talked about how the vegetables would need care, how the seedlings would come up if they planted them right. James listened more closely than usual, as if every word mattered. Then he looked at her and said, "You're almost like a real farmer now." Diep laughed, bright and clear, and the sound carried across the field. James laughed too, but every bit of joy hurt, because even as they stood there in the sunlight, sharing a moment so simple and warm, James knew it might not last. He could already feel it slipping away, second by second. Tomorrow's DNA results hovered over everything like an invisible blade. He looked at Diep and wondered if this was one of the last peaceful afternoons they would ever have together. The sun caught the beads of sweat on Diep's forehead, making them glimmer. Her smile was open and innocent. James watched her quietly, making a silent promise to remember everything: the smell of the soil, the sound of the wind, the warmth of standing beside her without needing to explain anything. As the afternoon went on, the field slowly filled with neat new rows. Diep picked up white radish seeds and held them out carefully. "This is white radish," she said. "I'll mark it here so we can tell it apart later." James nodded, though his gaze had started to drift. His thoughts kept pulling him toward tomorrow, toward the truth waiting for him whether he was ready or not. They dug more furrows together, and Diep said, "For kohlrabi, we should plant it a little faster than cabbage, right?" James followed her lead. His hands obeyed, but there was a faint tremor in them now. He kept trying to focus on the work, on the rhythm of planting, on the feeling of being beside her in the open field. But each time the future crossed his mind, his chest grew tighter. After a while, Diep turned to him and said, "If you're tired, you can rest for a bit, okay?" James shook his head immediately. "I'm not tired yet. You should rest for a while." But Diep looked at him more carefully than he expected. "I can tell you're already very tired." That small bit of concern hit him harder than it should have. He forced a smile, trying to hide what was really weighing on him. His body wasn't the problem, it was his heart. It had been carrying too much since the moment the DNA test was set in motion. Still, they kept working. After a while, James said, "Thanks to you, I've learned so many techniques." He meant it sincerely, but beneath the gratitude was regret so deep he could barely contain it. In another life, maybe this could have been enough. A field, a handful of seeds, a future built slowly side by side. He imagined a version of the world where tomorrow didn't exist. A world where they could keep planting together, laughing together, arguing over rows and seedlings and harvests. But that world was already slipping away. By late afternoon, the sunlight had turned golden, spilling softly over the newly planted rows. The seeds lay hidden beneath the earth, small and uncertain, like hope itself. James stood still for a moment and watched Diep in the fading light. Even if the vegetables grew strong and green, even if the field became beautiful, he feared what was growing inside him might never have the chance to live. At the seed shop, James stood in front of the counter with several small packets in his hands, cabbage seeds, red beet seeds, and a few others he had chosen with more care than he wanted to admit. He looked down at them, then up at the seller, and asked, "I need to prepare the soil first, right?" The seller nodded and started explaining the steps, speaking slowly, making sure he understood how deep to plant them and how much water they would need. James listened carefully, almost too carefully, like every instruction mattered for more than just growing vegetables. He frowned slightly and said, half serious and half anxious, "I'm worried that if I bury them too deep, they won't sprout." His fingers tightened around the seed packets as he spoke. The concern sounded simple on the surface, but the truth underneath ran much deeper. He wasn't only talking about seeds, he was talking about fragile things, about hope, about the fear that even with all the right effort, some things still might never grow. After thinking for a moment, he said, "Give me 3 bags of seeds. I'll plant them first and see how they do." The seller packed them up, and James paid without saying much more. But as he looked at the small bags resting in his hands, each one felt heavier than it should have. To anyone else, they were just seeds. To James, they were tiny promises, tiny chances, tiny pieces of a future he was still desperately trying to believe in. Softly, almost to himself, he murmured, "I hope they grow well. I hope they stay healthy and thrive." It sounded less like a comment and more like a prayer. When he stepped back outside, the late afternoon sun had begun to sink, stretching shadows across the road. James held the seed bags close as he walked, but his steps were slow and heavy. The warmth of the day was fading, and the closer evening came, the more tomorrow seemed impossible to ignore. He thought about Diep, about the field, about the rows they had prepared together with such quiet care. The memory still clung to him, the dirt on their hands, the sunlight on her face, the easy way she had spoken to him, as if there would still be a next time, and another after that. The wind carried the scent of damp soil past him again, and it instantly brought back the afternoon they had shared. James let out a slow breath, but it did nothing to lighten the weight in his chest. This wasn't just a stop at the seed shop. It felt like preparing for a future that might not even exist. He looked down at the seed packets once more and gripped them tighter. Even if they sprouted, even if the field came alive, tomorrow's DNA results could still cut through everything he had been trying to protect. And no matter how tightly he held on, there were some things his hands could never keep. By the time James got home, the light had dimmed. Inside the living room, the air felt thick and still. His father was already there, waiting, and the moment James stepped in, he knew this wasn't going to be a quiet evening. His father looked him over and asked sharply, "Where did you go dressed like that?" James didn't bother hiding it. "I went out with Diep again." The room seemed to tighten around those words. His father's expression hardened. "Diep is my sister." James turned toward him fully now, his own emotions finally rising to the surface. "Dad told me Diep is my sister," he said, voice controlled but unshaken. "But I still haven't given up." His father stared at him, stunned by the blunt honesty. James continued, "The DNA test has already been done, so if the results prove she really is my sister, then you won't need to stop me anymore. I'll be the one to step back. I'll distance myself from her on my own." For a moment, his father said nothing, but James wasn't finished. "And if the DNA test doesn't match this time, he said, each word landing with painful clarity. Then I hope Dad will never stop us from being together again. That was the truth he had been carrying for so long, and now that it was finally spoken out loud, it felt both freeing and unbearable. His heart was pounding so hard it almost hurt. Tomorrow had stopped being some distant fear. Now it was real, standing just in front of him. He swallowed and added quieter this time. Tomorrow, the DNA test results will come out, so maybe we should think of this as our last time together. The sentence cut through him the moment he said it. It was the kind of pain that comes from wounding yourself with the truth. Still, he forced himself to keep going. So, I have to smile when I see her, he said, voice trembling just slightly. I have to smile beautifully. She's waiting for me. His father looked at him, and for the first time, the anger in his eyes mixed with something else. Conflict, helplessness, maybe even pity. But James couldn't bear to stand there any longer. He turned and walked toward the stairs. Each step felt heavy. The house was quiet again, but this silence was different from the morning. This wasn't peaceful. It pressed down on him from every side. As he moved through the dimness, James kept repeating the same thought to himself over and over again. Keep smiling. No matter what happens, keep smiling. Because if this truly was the end, he didn't want Diep to remember him breaking apart. He wanted her to remember light. Later, beneath the fading gold of the late sun, James stood beside Diep once more in a field overflowing with flowers. Blossoms stretched out around them in bright colors, covering the path like a dream. The air was calm, and for a brief second, the scene was so beautiful, it almost felt unreal. Diep looked around with wide, delighted eyes and exclaimed, "There are so many beautiful flowers, brother." Her voice rang out bright and clear, full of genuine wonder. James smiled at her, just like he had promised himself he would. But inside, every beat of his heart felt sharp. This might be the last time they stood together like this, with nothing decided yet, with hope still barely alive. Diep pointed happily from one cluster of flowers to another, her eyes sparkling in the soft light. James watched her without looking away for long, trying to capture every detail and lock it somewhere permanent. The way she smiled, the way her voice lifted when she got excited, the way her eyes shone when she saw something beautiful. He wanted to remember all of it. The wind moved gently through the flowers, brushing petals into the air. Everything around them felt peaceful. But inside James, a storm had already begun. Fear, regret, longing, helplessness, they all twisted together until he could hardly breathe. Still, he kept smiling. Diep reached for his hand and asked, "Do you want to play this?" James nodded and sat beside her. They stayed there for a while, surrounded by blossoms, looking almost like children, stepping back into an old memory. And for James, that was exactly what made it hurt so much. He looked at Diep and felt his heart fill with a regret too big for words. If tomorrow's results proved they were really siblings, then maybe even this smile, this small, quiet smile he was wearing now, would be the last one he could ever give her. A stronger breeze swept across the field, scattering petals through the air like pieces of memory already starting to drift away. Not far from the flowers stood an old swing set. Diep sat down on one of the swings beside James and smiled with a kind of wistful happiness. "It's been such a long time since I played games like this," she said. Her voice carried a soft nostalgia. And when James looked at her, he saw something fragile in her eyes. Not sadness exactly, but the ache of remembering something far away and beautiful. He answered quietly, "Me too. Once childhood memories are gone, it's really hard to get them back." The words hit him the moment he said them, because that was exactly what this felt like something already slipping into the past, even while it was still happening. They sat there side by side, the swings moving gently, the chains creaking softly in the wind. Around them, flowers bloomed in every direction, bright and alive. But inside James, there was only sorrow, stretching further and further out. He looked at Diep again, and for a moment saw not just the person beside him now, but the child she used to be. That smile carried traces of someone innocent, untouched by confusion, untouched by boundaries, untouched by the cruel weight of truth, waiting just one day away. Memories rose in him all at once, a time without fear, a time without questions, a time when they could simply be close, without the world turning that closeness into something painful. Now, all of that could disappear because of one piece of paper. One result, one answer. James wrapped his hand tightly around the swing's chain, gripping it so hard his knuckles whitened. It was the only thing he could hold on to. He wanted to speak. He wanted to tell Diep everything he couldn't say. He wanted to freeze the moment, stop time, stay in this fading light forever. But the words never came. They stayed trapped in his throat, swallowed by silence. So he sat there quietly, carrying all of it alone. The wind began to blow harder, stirring the flowers, lifting petals into the air around them. They swirled and fell like a quiet farewell, like the world itself already understood that this moment was ending. James turned to look at Diep one more time. He didn't say anything. He only memorized her, the curve of her smile, the softness in her eyes, the way the evening light touched her face. He made himself a silent promise that no matter what tomorrow brought, no matter how much changed, he would keep this image with him forever. Twilight slowly settled over the field. The colors dimmed. The sky darkened. Shadows gathered around them until the bright sea of flowers began to fade into evening. And there, in that deepening dusk, James sat with a sorrow he couldn't name out loud and a feeling that by tomorrow might no longer be allowed to have a name at all.